Hello and welcome to the first of our 6 sessions on the book of Daniel as we go through the season of Lent. Now, this is our general introductory session as well as chapters 1 and 2. And we'll begin with the introduction. Now, Daniel itself has some interesting scholarship behind it. Most scholars place Daniel to circa 165 BC. And this is mainly because of the language involved. If you look at the language, there's 2 separate languages that were initially used in Daniel. And you can break it down as Daniel chapter 1 verse 1 through chapter 2 verses 4a, and then chapters 8 through 12, which were initially written in Hebrew. But then starting in chapter 2 verse 4b through the end of chapter 7 was initially written in Aramaic. And what's interesting with this is that Aramaic was the most common language in the ancient Near East, especially in Mesopotamia where Babylon would be, in the late Persian period. So after the events that are given in or accounted in the book of Daniel. But then you have other parts that are Hebrew, which is a little off. And this leads some to place Daniel in the time of a different exile, different foreign domination. The scholars also have yet to find any mentions of the book of Daniel prior to the 2nd century BC. It doesn't mean that the stories didn't exist beforehand, and there is evidence that indicates chapters 1 through 6, the stories that we really know of Daniel, were passed down in an oral tradition earlier. And this brings into using more the modern historical critical method of the idea that there were multiple authors of Daniel. It wasn't just Daniel writing this down, but multiple people. And it was attributed to Daniel, not to deceive people, but to kind of establish an authority to the book itself. And part of this also comes about because we know really nothing about Daniel except what's in this book of the Bible and a few of the apocryphal books that are tied to it. More on that later. But overall, Daniel has a simple message that God is sovereign over all the earth and over all history. Over all the kings, over all the empires. Everything can be swayed by God's will. Now, contextually, the events of Daniel tend to span from about 605 BC until 539 BC. And those events really are broken down into 2 separate sections. First, you have chapters 1 through 6. These are the books and events that we are typically more familiar with. The lion's den, the statue, the hand of the wall, the furnace. 7 through 12 have 3 distinct versions of the end of times. And there's no real connection to, minus the people involved, to chapters 1 through 6. And one of the ways, or how some of the scholarship looks on this, is that you can look at 1 through 6 almost as a series of novellas. Kind of events you can take in their own little realm without connection to one another. And those can really date orally from the time of the Babylonian exile. Even if they are tied to the Persian exile that came later. But they also really fit with the Hellenistic domination of the Hebrew people from 333 to 6 through 63 BC when the Romans took over. 7 through 12, this is apocalyptic literature. Basically, Daniel, the second half of Daniel is the revelation of the Old Testament. And much of this really does get tied into that Greek period later. It fits very well with the Maccabee rebellion against Antiochus, and we'll get into that later, including who the Maccabees were and how Daniel relates to Maccabees and some of the apocryphal works that are in a Catholic Bible, an Orthodox Bible, but aren't included in our Protestant Bibles. But this does fit with all apocalyptic literature, where people who are feeling oppressed are often drawn to the apocalyptic literature because it does give them hope, but also it helps them work through the times they are in, which shows the timeless nature of Scripture. Now, the book of Daniel doesn't give you a roadmap, like sometimes you can get out of Revelation. But it does render a picture of what is to come. Now in this, because we are taking this as a Bible study as well, there are some who look at Daniel as not a real person. But it's not that Daniel isn't necessarily real. It's kind of the same as with Job and Noah. There's trying to find proof that they exist is difficult. Doesn't mean they didn't exist, even if the authorship of the book is spread out over different people. But overall, this is the most unusual book of the Old Testament. But it is a book that reminds us of the power of God in the world. And that, at a minimum, is why this is important. As we enter chapter 1 of Daniel, there are going to be many passages of Scripture that I realized I did not put into your packet. Last time I taught this, I didn't need to. I don't have two massive whiteboards I can stand in front of and write everything out to give you a chance to copy. So there will be a link in the description or in the post itself to a PDF page with the different passages of Scripture, and I'll have some at church as well. Now, to place Daniel in the greater part of the Old Testament, the very beginning of chapter 1 sets in that this is the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Jerusalem, or Judah. Now, this ties into 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 1 and 2, and 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 5 and 7. Those mention King Jehoiakim. And we're dealing with the fall of the city, as is seen in verse 1. And the biblical counterparts to this are 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 4 through 21, Jeremiah chapter 52, verses 7 through 27, and Jeremiah chapter 39, verses 1 through 10. Those go into the fall of the city itself, as well as the prophecies of what was going to come from Ezekiel chapters 20 through 24, and again in Jeremiah 25, verses 8 through 11, which foretell the coming 70 years of captivity. Now, in the historical text of the Old Testament, we see that Jehoiakim remained a vassal in Jerusalem, according to 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 1. And we know from 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 8 through 15, Jeremiah 52, verse 29, and Ezekiel 1, verse 1, that 8 years later, 832 additional people from the city were exiled, including Jehoiakim's son, King Joachim. And one important thing to take as we get into this is what comes from verse 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands. As Jerome puts this in his commentary, since Jehoiakim is recorded as having been given over, it means the Babylonian victory is actually a victory of God, because God decided what was going to happen. King Nebuchadnezzar didn't win. God let this happen. This was God's choice. But immediately into this, we get, starting in verse 3, to bring some of the people from Israel into exile, and those who were skilled with all wisdom, knowledge, understanding, learning, like the gifted, especially the noble children, to bring into Babylonian service. We could ask, why noble children? We can ask why they would do this. And really, part of this, and I know Dr. David Jeremiah brings it up in his book about basically that all these people would be turned into eunuchs, which was a common ancient practice as those who would serve the king. That way they wouldn't have families, they wouldn't cause problems in the harem, would be turned into eunuchs. But why the practice in general of bringing basically in the noble children into the royal court? And part of this in general is the idea of you would take the best and brightest of the conquered people and bring them into your service to advise you and to help rule the empire. Basically bring in the best and brightest. But also the other side of this is those would be the type of people who'd be more likely to cause problems as well, because they had connections, they had wealth, they had knowledge that others didn't have. They would possibly be the ones who would lead a rebellion. So you basically bring them into your service, you pacify the people even more. And we know from general historic sources, this is about a 3-year training program to go through this. But this is where we're introduced to the 4. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we get name changes. Because Daniel becomes Belshazzar, Hananiah becomes Shadrach, Mishael becomes Meshach, and Azariah becomes Abednego. Now what's interesting, and this will be in that handout, or that additional piece of information, is that all the names have meaning. Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah means whom Jehovah has favored. Mishael means who is what God is. And Azariah is Yahweh has helped. In changing their names to Belshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Belshazzar means Bel's prince, Bel being the patron god of Babylon, which we could relate, it sounds close to Baal. You can have fun with that. Shadrach means inspired by the sun god Aku. Meshach, who can be compared to Shak. And Shak was the Babylonian name for the goddess Venus in Greek and Roman mythology. And Abednego means servant of the singing fire. The Babylonian fire god being named Nebo. So we're getting a name change where names that were honoring God now are being changed to names honoring Babylonian gods. And this is a big deal. I mean, we understand it in our own culture. Sometimes you get the book of baby names and see what names mean. But this is still meaningful in other cultures, not so much our own. In African culture, this is still very important. It was important in Native American culture that names reflect the person. This is the same in Hebrew culture. Names had meaning. And this is something we still see in the culture today, especially when one would convert to Islam, for example. Think of Muhammad Ali. His original name was Cassius Clay. He changed it in conversion. And biblically, we see this as well. We have Abram turning to Abraham in Genesis 17, verse 5. Jehoiakim, his name was actually given to him by Pharaoh, according to 2 Kings chapter 23, verse 24. Zedekiah himself was named by King Nebuchadnezzar in 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 13. And this brings us to a point of reflecting. What's the importance of a meaning of a name? How do we deal with naming children? How important was the meaning of our name when we were named? Or even thinking of the changing of names. And debates over when a couple gets married and what's the last name? Does one change their name? Is it a hyphenate? Do they keep their own? But here's another question, and this is one I really do not have an answer for you, just my own speculation. But in our practice, and at least thinking back what I was taught going into Sunday school, why do we call Daniel Daniel, but for his three contemporaries, we don't use their Hebrew names. We don't call them Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So we use the Hebrew name for Daniel, but we use the Babylonian names for the other three. No idea why. I will say I will probably use them a little interchangeably. I prefer to use the Hebrew names because I like consistency, but that's a whole other concept. But in chapter 1, after they are selected and brought into training, we get the thing with the diet. And it brings up the interesting thought about our own relationships with food. I mean, we could go back into the Old Testament, and again, this will be in the handout, or the digital handout in addition, of what some of the food issues were, because for these 4 young men, if they were trying to follow the kosher laws, this was going to be a problem. Because the Hebrew dietary laws are found in Leviticus 11, Leviticus 17, and Deuteronomy chapter 24, or chapter 14, sorry. Those are their dietary rules. The Babylonians weren't under those same rules. But even for us, sometimes we have that debate as well. Meanwhile, we go into Acts with get up, Peter, and eat when he went to see Cornelius. But this is a continuing issue of what can be eaten and couldn't be eaten within the Christian church. Romans 12, 2 Corinthians 6, 1 John 2, 1 Corinthians 8. The interesting thing with food, and we still deal with this, of what you should and should not eat. When looking with them, it's important to see the motivation behind it. And much of this was about faithfulness to God and not defiling themselves by eating the food. For some, it could be seen as they're keeping God's commands in the law of Moses. For others, they can see this as a sign of discipline and spiritually staying connected with God. We can also say they were trying to make sure they weren't eating food that was sacrificed to a pagan god, because people were practical. When an animal was sacrificed at an altar to a god, including in the temple, the entire animal was not consumed by fire. In the temple, it was the blood specifically was given to God, but things that were fragrant were burned. The rest of the meat, especially the temple, went to the priests, but there was also in most of the pagan world, they sacrificed the animal to a pagan god, and then the meat was sold in market. And this was an issue in the New Testament as Christianity spread. But here it is, you have them basically saying, let us eat our own diet. And you have to ask yourself, how bad could this be? Because it sounds like only these 4 out of all the ones that were taken into service had issue with this. And put it this way as well. They were eating at the king's table. They were eating the palace food. Now, you can't use the example so much of the White House right now because the current president does enjoy his fast food, and that's a whole other thing. But you think of like the palace food, the elaborate meals. You could probably find enough of this in the news dealing with the royal family with all their struggles right now. This was a big deal because they're refusing the king's food, but they're also refusing the good food. They were going to be eating well. So what's the deeper lesson here? As we look at some of this, in one aspect, this throws a wrench in the assimilation process. There's a reason the chief eunuch does not want this to happen. He's very cautious because that's part of the assimilation. They eat the food. They eat the food, they get used to the food, they leave their past behind and fully embrace being Babylonian. But at the same token, do you think they really cared what they ate? at a deeper level. And part of this is that idea of purity. This comes in some of the apocryphal sources, Tobit 1, Judith 12, 2 Maccabees 6 and 7, of the idea of staying true and pure to God and not assimilating into a fallen world and into sin. But in this, God does intervene because he's seen the faithfulness and these four's dedication to him. What's also interesting is what this says about the man who has to make this decision, that chief steward, Ashpenaz. He's seen here in a positive light because he lets the experiment happen. He could have refused this and said, too bad, you're gone. And he could have just had him killed. Instead, he lets the experiment happen, which is one of those examples where you see someone who isn't one of the Jewish people being seen in a favorable light and letting God's will be at work. And as we look at this, we have this 10-day experiment in which God intervenes. And the diet is basically no rich foods, no meat, no wine. Now, what's important in this is not the diet itself. This is not something to promote vegetarianism, veganism, or even full abstinence from alcohol. Instead, it was the deeper meaning behind it. Now, a number of years, there was a study. It was a 3-week study called the Daniel Plan Diet by Rick Warren, Daniel Amen, and Mark Hyman. And part of the practice was you would cut out animal protein for 3 weeks, and there was a fasting component of it. And the important thing was this wasn't meant to be the lifelong diet. It was basically a short spiritual practice, which would fit with the idea of the 10-week diet, or that 10-day diet experiment. This wasn't about, I'm never eating meat again, or never drinking wine again, or never eating rich food again. It was the fasting discipline of giving up something, abstaining from something physical, especially physically pleasurable, but turning that abstinence from those things into a spiritual gift to God, a sign of dedication to God. That's the important part of even a Lenten fast itself. It's not the idea to lose weight or to get better habits. It's giving something up in return, giving that time, that effort, the money, whatever, to God and to God's uses. So you're kind of getting a foretaste of a Lenten fast discipline here in chapter 1 of Daniel with this diet. And we see God responding. Because God, as you see in verse 17, God gave them learning, skills in all literature, wisdom, and Daniel understanding in all visions and dreams. Now, this isn't to be seen as earning things from God. These are gifts of God freely bestowed by God, not because of any human action or merit. Instead, God is bestowing them gifts in part because they were faithful. Their hearts were in the right place, and they were going to use them for God's higher purpose, not for their own. And that's an important aspect. As you look at spiritual gifts, they're not earned. They're given by God, not as a response to actions we already did, but because God is going to use them. And we see the fruit of this when they finally go before King Nebuchadnezzar, and they do 10 times better than everyone else. This is because they are divine gifts. Now, if we would look back into 1 Corinthians at the spiritual gifts, people can do those different spiritual gifts. You can learn to get better at them. But there's a difference between learning the gifts and God giving you the gifts. Being given the gifts by God is going to be significantly more effective than the effort than any effort we can put in to give those gifts, to learn them ourselves. And that's where we see here in chapter 1, as we round up this chapter itself, we have the first sign of faithfulness. We see God is in control of the kingdom, but also God is in control in individual lives as well. And we see God's response to the faithful as we seek to follow him. And what's important, this last verse, chapter 21, and Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. The chronologically in Daniel's kind of all jumbled. There's a reason why scholars think it's more than one author, and a few of the reasons they're saying this wasn't all written down by one person at the exact same time, because the chronological orders is kind of all over the place. But to say that he made it to King Cyrus, that means he survived King Nebuchadnezzar, King Amel-Marduk, Ergilisar, Lebasi Marduk, Nabonidus, King Belshazzar, and then into Cyrus, and potentially others. We'll get into that when the time comes. This is saying that he had a long role as this advisor of Babylonian. And we will see how God uses him and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to do God's work and be instruments as God controls the actions of Babylon and Persia. As we look to chapter 2, we get into the first really familiar story that could spread. And this is King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now, when we look at this, we have to think about how God communicates with people. And one of the ways we do see scripturally is through dreams. Now, I put a caveat here. Not every dream is a message from God. Just going to say it. It does not mean it doesn't happen, but I would not say this is the norm for anyone. But this is a way that God has communicated with people. And we see this earlier in Genesis with Joseph. And really, what's important when we think about God using it as dreams, I'm going to go back to St. Jerome and his commentary, where he gives the idea of that it's not either Pharaoh or, in this case, Nebuchadnezzar, who deserved dreams from God, but instead, God used those dreams as the means for first Joseph, and in this case, Daniel, to receive preference from the king. So there is a means to an end for this. And in this, he had a dream, a profound dream. It was one that he sat and went, this troubles him. So the first thing he does is he calls his advisors. And depending on the translation you have, some bring up the Chaldeans, others bring up sorcerers, and the language, some say magicians too. And the language is important, because sorcerers typically has a darker meaning to it. You can look back and see that in the Bible, sorcery specifically is listed as a sin. Enchanters would typically say as a magician. Chaldeans, I always find that interesting because there's an entire Chaldean Catholic Church based in modern-day Baghdad. But Chaldeans may refer more to like astronomers, astrologer types, like looking for meaning in stars and things of that. So a little bit different. But these men, astrologers, soothsayers, exorcists, wonder workers, whatever they are, these were ones who were trained in special books and enchantments and predictions, but all the earthly training they were given. What's interesting is they can't determine God's will in this dream. That's really through 11 is the fact they can't figure this out. They don't know it. They don't have the wisdom from God to discern God's ways. What's interesting is who can. And we know through Scripture that there are people who do it better than these earthly educated wise men. And there is some speculation of, especially when you get to his reaction in verse 12, that he was so furious at them, he basically wanted all the wise men killed. All those people trained for all those years in the palace. And we can ask, why? And part of that could be he was testing their skill. These were people who were housed by the king, clothed by the king, fed by the king. They lived on the king's dime, and you can understand his frustration that all these people who took up so many resources from his palace couldn't give him the answer he wanted. Now, it's interesting timeline-wise of when this happened. This would have happened before the fall of Jerusalem, but so there would have been no exiles there yet. Daniel wouldn't have been there yet. I think this may give some validation to the idea these stories were passed down orally for so long that no one just picked. And now we have historic records that we go, wait a minute, timelines aren't, exactly lining up. They're off. Does it really matter? Not really, in the grand scheme of things. But also the other side of this is he was so disturbed by this dream, he wanted the answer, and there's frustration here at that they can't get it. And when we think about it today, how good are the people we turn to for advice? Not touching the political side with a 10-foot pole. But who do we individually go to when we seek advice? What's interesting, when I first taught this and started writing it and everything else years ago, the names I came up with now, no one would think of today, because I mentioned Oprah and Ellen, which 6 years ago, they had different reputations than they do today. But it does bear the point. Some of the people we turn to advice are people who probably should not be giving advice. I mean, I still find it laughable. Celebrities, athletes, politicians, not always the people you should seek out for wisdom. And even knowing full well where we are at, we have the other side where there is that deference to authority, especially with credential authority. But that doesn't always work out either, because someone may be educated well in something but not be wise. Wisdom is different from knowledge. So who do we go to for advice? Something to dwell upon. But really, starting in verse 12, when he's about to have them killed, this is where Daniel enters the story. Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah aren't part of this. But then again, Daniel was the one who was given the gift of interpreting dreams, not the other three. And when Daniel enters, he does give the greeting, as that others give of, "O King, live forever." When Daniel says it, it's almost a bit ironic, because he knows the king cannot live forever. But as he enters in 17, knowing what's going to happen, he doesn't hightail it out, because he's one of the wise men. Instead, he requests to see the king, to basically go into a dangerous place. So he goes, and really, he does meet with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But he goes there for the prayer support. They're not going to get the vision itself. They're there to help reinforce him getting the vision. This is one of those important things for us, especially as we are in Lent, the idea of the discipline of prayer. Knowing the situation, setting a time to meet with the king, he is going in there, he is going to go in prepared, not by dwelling upon it, relying on his own knowledge, but by relying on God and seeking God's wisdom. And this does give us the idea of how we should face these difficult tasks ourselves. Not just in prayer, but prayer together. Gathering together and all seeking God's wisdom. And in this, we have the account of his prayer. You see this at the second half of verse 20 through 23. And it does give us the idea of what he's asking for and why. He's honoring God first, an important part of prayer, acknowledging what God can do, and then praising God. Notice he's not saying, please God, give me the answers. It's saying, praise be to God, God who gives wisdom, God who reveals things. We give you thanks and praise. And we ask you, after all that, let us know what you told the king. Because so far the king hasn't told him the dream. Daniel's going to go in with the knowledge beforehand. So at that point he goes in. And I know I kind of jumbled around a little bit. But it's basically, he knows the situation. He seeks God's praise, not for his own benefit. There's nothing in that prayer says, so I may live, or mention what he may get out of it, but just that he may know what has been told the king. And then he goes to the palace in verse 24 to say, I have the interpretation of the dream. Do not kill all the other wise men. Which is interesting that he doesn't want basically these pagan advisors who are raised in the arts of things that are kind of different from what God wants, who do not serve God, spare their lives. There's a lesson in there. And then he describes the dream, and this is where we get the statue in the interpretation. And now you can deal with my wonderful art, because obviously I was not an art major. But he gets the image of this statue. Now this is where things start. This is your foretaste of what's going to come in the last 6 chapters. Where we have the statue basically made of different elements mixed together. Iron, clay, bronze, silver, gold. And then a rock comes down, crushes it. Forgot to draw the stone. This rock comes down and crushes it. And basically, this is nothing unusual. There were statues in the ancient world that were made of mixed elements. So this is a realistic thing. And the Babylonians were known for their statues. So what are they? I mean, you have the gold head, the silver body, bronze kind of torso or upper thighs, iron legs, iron and clay mixed down at the bottom at the feet and then on the ground. And I'll just put the big stone. This is seen as a progression of empires throughout history, with the idea that the head itself was King Nebuchadnezzar, Neo-Babylonian Empire. God trusts him and gives him sovereignty. He's not a villain for us. What comes next is the silver, the empire that's going to, basically Babylon comes first, then it's going to be oftentimes seen as the Median Empire or kingdom. We don't have any history of this. We see this as Darius the Mede, and it's a bit convoluted. The brass would be the Persian, iron the Greek. Iron and clay is unstable. The mixing of them together, it's not as strong as, it's not going to last. And this was seen as potentially the reign of Alexander the Great in the is he builds this great empire, that's the iron. After him, he divides the kingdom. And it becomes a mix of different dynasties, like the Ptolemies in Egypt, of which Cleopatra would be a member, being the last Ptolemaic queen of Egypt before the fall to Rome. You had the Seleucids, who stayed in the Middle East, being iron. You kind of had it became an unstable environment that led to the rise of Rome. The stone is God's kingdom. And by the stone crumbling the entire statue, it's the victory of God's kingdom over the earthly kingdoms. Now, that is one interpretation. It is not the only interpretation, because another one holds that gold is Babylon, silver is Persia, brass is Greece, and iron is Rome. And then basically the iron and clay would be, some would say there's a prophetic gap in there, and then that would just be the mix mash of all the different earthly kingdoms and God's kingdom destroying it all. So it's one of those things that's open to interpretation. And there are some, I guarantee, if you wanted to go down the rabbit hole, you could go on the internet and find new interpretations, including the modern world. That maybe it would go Babylon, Persia, Greek, Rome, or maybe just taking out the Greeks. Like it's one of those interesting things when you get to kind of the apocalyptic prophecies, of which this kind of is. It's foretelling the God, ultimately of the end, God's kingdom will topple all earthly kingdoms. And this is why he was unnerved, because basically he realized here's a massive statue, which would be familiar to him. This is realistic for him. He could have easily seen it as, this is going to be the fall of my kingdom. Who is going to destroy my kingdom? Instead of what it really is. Of course, there's another one with this as well. And this reads more into post-exile dealing with the Greeks, of the different values that are held by the precious metals themselves. And from the return of exile, where gold is kind of symbolic of the gold captured in the temple and in Jerusalem when Jerusalem fell. Silver was always a coin used for taxation as a sign of Jewish poverty. Like I said, you could go down plenty of rabbit holes with this that we don't need to go through. But the overall message that is given is really the reassurance to King Nebuchadnezzar that the kingdoms coming after him will be inferior to him. The sign of God trusting this foreign ruler. And ultimately, the role of God in this. That in the end, God will set up a kingdom that cannot be destroyed. At which point, we're getting into, and this is at verse 46, Nebuchadnezzar's reaction. One, he could be relieved that he's considered a great king, that this God, as he says, truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings. It's one of the interesting things with Nebuchadnezzar throughout Daniel. He says something very close, but he never goes the full way. He doesn't turn his back to the Babylonian gods and Babylonian culture. He doesn't 100% dedicate himself to God, but he does acknowledge God as God. He is not a villain in this book. And this is, again, something very interesting. With the idea that the foreign king here is affirmed. You're not getting a future promise of an independent Jewish state of Israel or Judah and return to complete freedom and freedom from foreign domination. But here you have a foreign king being seen as giving homage to God and raising up God's servant Daniel. As well as here we see the changeover, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego at the end of chapter 2. But these four who were involved in discerning the prayer, even though Daniel was the messenger, credit's also given to the 3 who were praying with him. And Nebuchadnezzar raising them up to rule over Babylon. Basically, Daniel becomes the equivalent of the prime minister of the entire country, and the other 3, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, overseeing vast provinces because of their wisdom from God, and King Nebuchadnezzar realizing God is God, and God is with these 4, and raising up those for whom would serve God and for whom God would work with. So that kind of wraps up our time for this week. As always, you're going to see throughout this week, the packet is divided down into really 5 different days, breaking down the 2 chapters with reflection questions. You can do them independently, or you could join a group. I know there is one that's already formed. You can form your own. You can invite other people into this because everything is available digitally. Also, Wednesday night, if you would like to come on with me and ask questions and get some more clarification, that's available to you. Just reach out to me so you can receive the Zoom link. But I invite you now to delve deeper in the text and reflect on how God is working through this text to bring you closer to Him in faith.